Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Carolyn Gregoire, and I'm the events manager here at Tricycle. Today is the last in our week-long series with Shambhala Publications, Secularizing Buddhism, New Perspectives on a Dynamic Tradition. Today's Zoom session will be recorded for anyone who is unable to attend live, and we'll make it available on Tricycle's YouTube channel. The link will be posted in the chat in case you want to share it with friends who can't be here, or if you'd like to watch it again. So we're providing these events for free, and if you haven't already and would like to support this offering, please consider giving at the donation link in the chat. You can also find a link in the chat for 30% off the book Secularizing Buddhism. We will leave some time for Q&A at the end of this event today, so feel free to type in your questions at any time, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. All right, so our guests today are Roger Jackson and Jay Garfield. Roger Jackson is the John W. Nason Professor Emeritus of Asian Studies and Religion at Carleton College, where he taught the religions of South Asia and Tibet. His scholarly interests include Indian and Tibetan Buddhist systems of philosophy, meditation, and ritual, Buddhist religious poetry, the study of mysticism, religion in Sri Lanka, and the contours of modern Buddhist thought. He's the author of books including Is Enlightenment Possible and Tantric Treasures. He also has 2 books forthcoming from Shambhala Publications, Rebirth, A Guide to Mind, Karma, and Cosmos in the Buddhist World, and Saraha, Poet, Mystic, Philosopher. And Jay Garfield chairs the philosophy department and directs the Tibetan Studies program in Tibetan Studies in India program at Smith College. He is also a visiting professor of Buddhist philosophy at Harvard Divinity School, professor of philosophy at Melbourne University, and adjunct professor of philosophy at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies. His books include Knowing Illusion, Bringing a Tibetan Debate into Contemporary Discourse, and Buddhist Ethics, A Philosophical Exploration. Academicinfluence.com has identified him as one of the 50 most influential philosophers in the world over the past decade. So we're so thrilled to have both of you here. Welcome, and I will hand it over to you, Jay.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. And thanks, Roger, for this wonderful opportunity for us to talk about this fascinating topic, and for the terrific essay you contributed to the volume with a wonderful double entendre title. So I just wanted to open up with a kind of broad question and thought we might discuss this for a little bit. And that question is this: what does it mean in the first place to secularize Buddhism, as this volume suggests? And why are you and other people like the other contributors to this volume interested in doing that? And as you think about that question, I'd like you to also talk about this issue. Is there something distinctive about Buddhism among the world's religious traditions that invites secularization, or anything special about the present moment that demands the secularization of religion? Anyway, just love to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay, yeah. First of all, I would want to say that I'm not sure I am seeking to secularize Buddhism. I contributed to a volume and talked about processes that have happened within, sort of under the purview of modernity in the last couple of centuries, whereby many people within the Buddhist world, and this counts both the Buddhist world in Asia and the growing Buddhist world in the West, have sought to somehow reconcile or make sense of Buddhism in the context of what we often associate with modernity, a set of ideologies and technologies that are perhaps most clearly associated with the West, and indeed in part with Western hegemony, Western colonialism, Western intellectual projects. All of this has posed a challenge for Buddhists, again, both in Asia and in the West. But I don't think actually that Buddhism is unique in this. I should say at the outset that I'm not generally sympathetic to those who think of Buddhism as simply a way of life or a philosophy of life, that I guess because I've tended to study traditional Buddhism in its original Asian settings, it seems very clear to me that Buddhism is a religion. They are much like we would identify Christianity, Islam, Judaism, various Hindu traditions as religions. And so it's really a question of how religious Buddhists think about what it means to be Buddhist in the modern era, given the challenges to traditional religion that modernity has posed in terms of, the ideologies of science, of socialism, of capitalism, and technological revolutions, various elements that we might, you can do this much more precisely, but generally speaking, those are kind of hallmarks of modernity. And, above all, it seems to me the challenge that modernity poses to Buddhists, but to religious people more generally, is how to make sense of a traditional cosmology and traditional set of rituals and practices that date to the pre-modern era and that are in many cases thrown into question by the various ideologies and practices of modernity. So, to take the case in point here, it's probably true that throughout most of Asian history, Asian Buddhist history, rebirth was taken for granted. Sometimes it was debated and argued for, or occasionally argued against, but mostly it was taken for granted. Just as the traditional Christian cosmology, say until the Enlightenment in the West, was largely taken for granted. But modernity brings all that into question. And by the same token, the power, the political power, the social power, sometimes the economic power that Buddhist institutions had, say in traditional Asian settings, are not as obviously prominent in the modern era, again, with the rise of nation states and other institutions that bring this into question. So it's a matter, as Clifford Geertz memorably put it, the question for modern religious people isn't actually whether to be religious. I think we tend to think that's the big question. Should I be religious? It's really more a question of how to be religious. So how are we religious in the modern world? And in the specific case of Buddhism, there has been an intellectual tendency, at least since serious Western study of Buddhism began a couple of centuries ago, to see elements of Buddhism as anticipating, say, modern science or democracy or socialism. There's a great deal of literature out there that tries to make these points, and whether this is true to the historical record is a totally separate question, but it's obvious that the fact that Buddhism, for instance, denies a creator God typically, that it does analyze the world into what you might almost describe as atomic events, that it sees change and impermanence as being fundamental. All these have tended to make Buddhism seem like somehow it stands apart from other religions and being sort of uniquely prescient about what scientists and others in the modern world were going to discover. So I don't happen to think that works as well as many people think it does, but you can understand how people would want to do this. It's fairly typical when a religious tradition comes into a new cultural setting to try to comprehend it through the categories and the ideas that are there in that setting. Mm-hmm. So understandably, Westerners coming into contact with Buddhism for the first time have tried to see it through the lenses of science or democracy or any number of other, as I said, ideologies and practices of the modern world.
Well, let me push you a little bit on one thing that you said that I found kind of interesting. And that is, you pointed out that modernity and the kind of entrance of modernity into Asia in this way can be seen as a kind of artifact of a Western colonialist project. And that a whole lot of this drive to secularize seems to come from a uniquely European approach to science. So I'm wondering if this secularization, and in particular in the context of thinking about rebirth, strikes you as politically problematic, or and especially difficult moment in the interaction between the West and Asian cultures?
I think it is quite problematic, and the whole question of who gets to tell whom about a particular religious tradition X or Y has to be approached very, very cautiously and very, very sensitively. But I think it is at the same time important to note, as I tried to indicate at the outset, that the process of modernization, even if it was, shall we say, pushed or instigated to some degree by Asian contacts with the West of one sort or another, and it's not always just colonial, but that's a fair part of it, that people in these societies themselves felt the need to respond to what they saw as the ideological, practical, and technological challenges posed by modernity as a Western construct. So it's people within these cultures are themselves, or have been really for the last 2 centuries, have been responding to modernity. And I wouldn't say that secularization has necessarily been the way they have generally gone. I see secularization as being at the sort of far end of a spectrum that runs roughly from traditionalism or literalism on the one hand, through a kind of neo-traditionalism that seeks to maintain much of tradition, but to sort of revamp the way it's described in more modern terms, onto what I would call modernism, which is fairly skeptical of traditional cosmologies and ideas, and yet wants to sort of retain them reinterpreted, whether it's existentially or psychologically or in some other mode, to secularization or secularism, which to me is at a far end. And the danger of secularization or secularism, at least as I see it, is that it ends up, as one of my students long ago put it in a thesis title, it throws out the baby with the bathwater. That you end up with a version of Buddhism that is really a kind of Buddha-sized, to coin a term, a kind of Buddha-sized secular humanism. So I think everybody, and this is true in Asia and it's true in the West, sort of has to find their way to some point on this spectrum that I imagine. But anyway, my point in response to your question is that it's not, I don't think it's a uniquely Western phenomenon.
Let me bring the conversation right back into rebirth here in a direct way.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, one of the great modernists of Buddhism is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who has argued that Buddhism has always been scientific, has always been naturalistic, and that Buddhism and science are completely in lockstep with one another. Some people have been skeptical of that view, other people have rejoiced in that view. But in this process of naturalizing Buddhism, one of the areas that has been really recalcitrant to naturalization is rebirth, right? And I'm wondering whether you think there are any prospects for a naturalization of Buddhist doctrines of rebirth, either in a kind of literalist way or in some other way. So I'm thinking, for example, if we look at some of the naturalizations of Vedanta that we saw happening at the beginning of the 20th century, and so we see Vivekananda saying, you think Maya is something transcendental. No, it's just ordinary confusion about what makes life worthwhile. You want money instead of happiness, that's Maya, right? You think that your happiness is going to be permanent if you just get a good job, that's Maya. And so we got this, real attempt to naturalize all of the categories of Vedanta back then. And I'm just wondering whether you think that rebirth is on the table for naturalization.
I think that many people would like to see it on the table for naturalization. I mean, I think you have to take a step back and ask, what does it mean to naturalize something? And I think actually that even a traditional Buddhist, but who's conversant with modern ways of speaking, would say that actually Buddha's rebirth is completely natural. Because of the particular relation that obtains between mind and body, as posited in most Buddhist traditions over the years. It's what I would say, though there's plenty of room for argument and disagreement on this, that classically Buddhists from the very earliest texts we have down into relatively recent times have argued for what I've called a kind of interactionist dualism, or a dualist interactionism, if you will, whereby mind and body are substances in the very broad, basic philosophical sense of that term, not in the sense of material substances, that are separate enough in nature that they are separable at the time of death, but are close enough as, again, substances, if you will, that interaction is possible and in fact is ongoing a good part of the time. So that's a preliminary comment to the effect that, what's natural in a Western sort of post-Enlightenment scientific vocabulary and discussion, and I would suppose philosophy of mind, though you're much more conversant with that than I am. You would say that this is kind of a non-starter, that if rebirth in this, let's say in the more or less literal sense that I die and then after my death I'm reborn in this realm or that realm, and that this has been a beginningless process and it could be an endless process if I don't get my act together, that this is problematic in the language of science, which tends to be rooted in one version or another of materialism. There's many versions of this, of course, identity theory and physicalism and epiphenomenalism and all these different ways you can approach that, but that is problematic. So it seems to me that what I see various people trying to do is, as you say, to naturalize rebirth by appealing to a number of different ways of coming at this. For instance, to argue that instances of past life recollections are, if you will, some kind of empirical or experiential evidence of rebirth, or that near-death experiences tell us something, or out-of-body experiences, and others will look to what I would describe as somewhat more radical solutions that try to reconceive the cosmos less in materialistic terms and more in terms of the cosmos as, say, information. Which pushes towards perhaps mentalistic ways of thinking about things that would then make the prospect of rebirth in the kind of literal sense less problematic. But of course that pushes you out towards a kind of non-standard physics. And I don't know much about physics, so I'm loath to comment much on that. Does that get at your?
Yeah, let me try to give it a different angle on this.
All right.
So part of what we're talking about, I think, in our conversation so far is the effect of the transmission of Buddhism out of classical Asia to the modern West on what we do with a doctrine such as rebirth. And sometimes helpful, I think, to think about transmissions historically as well. And of course, there have been many transmissions of Buddhism. And the one that always intrigues me when I'm thinking about the contemporary transmission is the transmission of Buddhism to China, classical China, as a model for this transmission. Because here's what I mean by that. I mean, as we know, when Buddhism went into Tibet, it went into a fairly primitive culture without a written language, without a really clear religious institutions, without philosophical tradition and all of that. And so it was just, Indian Buddhism was just adopted whole cloth. But when Buddhism went into China, as you know, it's going into this extremely literate culture with active religious traditions and active philosophy and poetry and art and so forth. And by the way, no rebirth. And so when Chinese scholars and practitioners started looking at Buddhism and started hearing that their ancestors were actually getting reborn, that was a real deal breaker. And Buddhism in China basically responded to that deal breaker by saying, fine, we won't talk about that. And except for some strains of the Shin tradition, but even those are getting metaphorical now, rebirth really never played much of a role in Chinese and then in Japanese Buddhism. And so that's not naturalization, that's just dismissal. And that's raised the view among a lot of people. And I've just hear this again and again, that rebirth isn't Buddhist, rebirth is just old South Asian doctrine. And if we don't need to become old South Asians to become Buddhists. So we don't need to take up rebirth, since that's just a really weird artifact of a South Asian origin. Mm-hmm. And so just as we don't pick up caste, why pick up rebirth? The Chinese didn't, why should we? Yeah. And I'm wondering how that strikes you as another response to
I think there are elements of what you say that I would agree with, and elements that I would at least shift around slightly. I would agree with you broadly that you can divide, when you're talking about the transmission of Buddhism within Asia, you can very roughly speaking talk about adoption cultures, I call them, and adaptation cultures. Adoption cultures, Tibet would be an example, perhaps Sri Lanka would be an example, where the kind of superstructure of long-standing, quote, civilization, a term one should always use with caution, was not very well in place, and where Buddhism itself helped to provide the basis for political unity, ideological movements of various sorts, or of another, ritual and whatnot. And then in adaptation cultures, and I think you're right that China is a perfect example of this, where there was a long-standing tradition, of literary language, great literature, well-established religious traditions for thousands of years, or at least 1,000 years or more before the arrival of Buddhism. There had to be a considerable amount of adaptation on the part of Buddhists in order for them to succeed in China. And let's make no mistake about it, Buddhism is a missionary religion and has sought to succeed wherever it has gone. A couple of qualifications, though. First of all, on the South Asian side, I would say that the particular issue you describe in terms of China with ancestor worship is not absent at all from South Asian religious traditions, and that in fact rebirth probably posed as much of a problem for ordinary South Asians in terms of what the hell had happened to their ancestors, as it eventually did for Chinese. We know, of course, China is famous for filiality, ancestor worship, and whatnot, but it's part of Hindu ritual, and it's actually become part of Buddhist ritual in South Asia on various occasions to provide food for ancestors. I mean, pretas, or hungry ghosts, are an example of this, and that goes deep back in South Asian literature. So I don't think that the problem is a uniquely Chinese one. I think the problem of feeling close to one's familial ancestors and trying to somehow reconcile this with the idea that they may have gone off to some other realm and are no longer accessible to you is something that Buddhists have always dealt with. Now, in the case of China, maybe it was even more of an issue, but I think I would also, again, qualify some of what you say, because I don't although there are certain East Asian Buddhist traditions that I think we can agree don't put discussions of rebirth, or perhaps even karma, and karma and rebirth are intimately related, doesn't put them at the forefront. Nevertheless, and I think Zen, or Chan/Zen/Son/Tien would be an example of this if you simply read the literature of this tradition. And Pure Land types of Buddhism, I would are perhaps the modern ones maybe see the Pure Land as metaphorical, but I think it's fair to say that traditionally it was assumed that you could be reborn in Amitabha's Pure Land, and that certainly was taking rebirth quite seriously. The other thing is just to recall that although Buddhism coming from South Asia definitely posed challenges to Chinese ideologies and practices, it actually fit in more easily than one might imagine. There already were notions in China of a kind of afterlife, in fact, a kind of bureaucratized afterlife that's been much discussed. And in a way, you could see the Buddhists as simply adding on kind of layers of complexity to versions of the afterlife that already were extant in China. I will agree with you that this question of ancestor worship and what becomes of ancestors remains a tricky point. But I guess I don't see as big a division between East Asian and South Asian as you do.
Well, I do like the image of India adding layers of bureaucracy to Chinese bureaucracy. India has always been good at that. But I still want to push the point a little bit, maybe not, I don't want to belabor the historical points, but the idea that a lot of Western Buddhists and also Westerners who are interested in Buddhism have, that rebirth really is a South Asian idea, not a Buddhist idea. And just as, I don't need to, grow long fingernails to practice, in a Tibetan tradition, I don't need to, believe everything that South Asians believed in order to practice a religion that happens to have originated there. And I just hear that so often. And let me just give a kind of contrast by a contrasting analogy. I'm just trying to imagine a group of contemporary Chinese converts to Catholicism. And I want to imagine them saying, you know what, the resurrection of Christ, that really is just a bit of Middle Eastern folklore. Nobody could take seriously the idea that somebody could die and then be resurrected in this world. And we'd like to be Catholic, but honestly, that's just that's just Middle Eastern folklore. We don't need that. We'll be Catholics without the resurrection. Now, I think people would look at them kind of funny, right? And say, I don't know that that's possible. And by the way, we don't like cannibalism either. So that bit about the sacrament, let's leave that aside as well. We'll be Catholics without the sacrament and without resurrection. But otherwise, we're just going to be completely Catholics because we're going to pay attention to all of those great philosophical teachings of St. Paul. And I'm wondering if that's an analogy for Western Buddhists to say, you know what, I don't want that Indian South Asian stuff. I don't believe in Mount Meru. I don't believe in rebirth. And what I want to do is just follow those words of wisdom of the Buddha in the Pali Canon that don't give me South Asian myths as part of it. Are they kind of like my mythical Chinese Catholics, or what's going on there?
That's a very good question, and I don't know that I have a really good answer to it. I would point out that, of course, many modern Protestants and not a small number of Catholics have in fact come up with their own. Rudolf Bultmann is the most important example that comes to my mind immediately, who tried to demythologize Christianity and to see the resurrection and so forth as existential. So I think there's a certain similarity there. It's going to back up to people asking themselves, what is pardon me for using this word in a Buddhist context, but what is essential and what is accidental? Or as my student put it, what's the baby and what's the bathwater? There was a very interesting, I actually start out my article by referring back to to my mind, famous debate, the Tricycle stage in 1997, when Stephen Batchelor published Buddhism Without Belief. So a debate between him and Robert Thurman on the whole question of whether you could be a good Buddhist without believing in rebirth. And it probably won't surprise too many people in the audience to know that Batchelor thought that it was not crucial to believe in rebirth in order to be a good Buddhist. And Thurman argued very strongly in favor of the idea that you had to you really couldn't practice Buddhism fully if you didn't believe in rebirth. And so this is part of the negotiation that goes on when religions confront modernity, deciding, again, to use that term, what's essential, what's accidental, and what can we absolutely not do without. I think, if I had to stake my money on it, I would say that the case with rebirth is a little bit different than the case with, say, Christianity, with Christians who might reject the resurrection. But again, you'll find plenty of more traditional Buddhists and including Westerners who will say no. Part of Thurman's point, and I've heard this echoed by others that I've discussed this with as well, is if you don't believe in rebirth, then what meaning do, say, bodhisattva vows or the development of bodhicitta have? You're vowing until enlightenment to work for the benefit of all beings, and if there's only just this one life in which you're doing that, doesn't it just becomes a pale imitation of
let's focus on that for a minute, because of course when Bob cites that, he's citing the promontocity chapter argument that Dharmakirti offers, that you and I have actually both written about, and I've always been interested in that argument because it's sometimes cast, and Gyaltsep casts it that way, as an argument for the reality of rebirth. But of course, if you read it, what it really is an argument that you've got to believe in rebirth, whether you can prove it or not, for exactly that reason, because the bodhisattva path, Dharmakirti argues, makes no sense unless you've got a genuine aspiration to attain awakening, and no sane person could think they're going to attain awakening this lifetime. So you've got to believe that there's going to be future lives. Now, I'll tell you what, I think that's a terrible argument. And I'd love to know what you think about it. And here's why I think it's a terrible argument, right? I think it's a terrible argument because it confuses the need to believe in the future with the need to believe in my future. So if I imagine myself building, I'm switching sides a few times in this discussion, but I think it's fun to do that. If I imagine myself building a medieval cathedral that might have taken 300 or 400 years, and I'm working on the foundation, I think of myself as building that cathedral and committed to that project, even though my grandchildren won't live to see it done. If I'm working on a major scientific project that I think is going to take generations, I might see myself as committed to it and knowing that my work's going to be instrumental, even if I'm not going to be around later. And I've always thought that you could think of bodhicitta like, and this is a reply to Bob, right? That if you could think of bodhicitta like that and just say, hey, I'm committed to the importance of somebody awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings. And, I'll work with my students and get them a little further along, and they'll work with some other students, and generations down the road, this particular cathedral will be finished and sentient beings will be liberated. And you might even say that's a version of bodhicitta with less ego grasping than Dharmakirti wants, right? Because, hey, I'm not involved in that, right? So I'm wondering what you think of that promontocity argument that really does underlie Thurman's defense against Batchelor.
Well, I would say first that I find what you just articulated intriguing in the extreme, and I think there's a lot that could be said for it. I'm not sure I agree that you've characterized Dharmakirti's argument quite fairly, because you say that Dharmakirti is basically saying you've got to believe in past lives and future lives, whereas Dharmakirti, and I think those who have followed him first in Indian tradition and then especially in Tibetan tradition, believes that he has shown through rational demonstration that rebirth must be the case. And the major focus of the first half of the Pramanasiddhi chapter, this is the second chapter, at least by Tibetan accounting, of Dharmakirti's masterwork, the Pramanavartika, or Exposition of Valid Cognition. Anyway, he's actually setting out to show that the Buddha is pramana, is an authority, pramana bhuta, someone who has become authoritative. And he sets out to show this through proving that the Buddha could become fully compassionate. That's he says the proof, in a sense of a logical proof, is compassion. And he then in the second half of the chapter, he sets out to prove that the Four Noble Truths are true, and that therefore the Buddha is a truth speaker and we should rely on him. Anyway, it's the first half of the chapter that has a really detailed attempt at a proof of rebirth. And this is done primarily, it's done partly through a rejection of sort of contemporaneous materialist arguments in India. But it's done above all, and this circles back to something I said much earlier, it circles back to a set of arguments about the actual relation between mind and body. Because if you can't show that mind is sufficiently independent of the body, we would now typically say the brain, but if you can't show that mind is sufficiently independent of body, that it can survive death, then this is it. The materialists are right, game's over. And if, as is fairly obvious, you can't develop infinite compassion or compassion to the nth degree in a single life, or the people who can do so are very, very rare anyway. And if we are to have any spiritual hope, then there must be multiple lives in which to practice and develop.
Notice you've relied on the spiritual hope point there, right? That is the aspiration. Bodhicitta requires the belief in future lives. And I think that's really the core there. I mean, there's the terrible argument about homogeneity of causes that nobody can take seriously, right? And then there's this one that says you can't be at least a Mahayana Buddhist unless you believe in rebirth, because you can't take your own perfectibility seriously. And if you can't cultivate bodhicitta. That's the Mahayana path, right?
Right,
So
right. I agree. Yes, yes. That's certainly the framework within which Dharmakirti is arguing. But
so
I would want to.
What do you think of the argument? What do you think of the argument?
You know, I wrote about this long ago. It feels like a past life, in fact, my sort of Dharmakirti phase. But I argued then, and I think I would still be tempted to argue now, that that when, for instance, Dharmakirti gets down to it and says that, well, body is coarse and material and insentient, and mind is clear and immaterial and knowing, and that therefore the one cannot be the substantial cause or the sort of indispensable condition of the other, and that's the core of his argument. That seems to me more or less to beg the question.
Yeah.
Because it's defining these terms in such a way that you obviously they're going to end up being different. But let me just add that in recent times, I'm not sure I would go back on that, but I've got to say that you might imagine that in his own way, Dharmakirti is raising what philosophers of mine, and again, you can say much more about this than I can, and tell me whether I'm right about this, called the hard problem, or the very hard problem. The fact that all the materialist and neurological explanations we can give about how mind, in quotes, supposedly works on a neurological basis, can't ever, perhaps even in principle, fully account for the experiential side of our existence. And that there's a way in which maybe Dharmakirti is gesturing at that.
I think you're right that he is. I mean, we're about to head down a rabbit hole into which I do not want to duck, because fighting about whether there is a hard problem or how hard it is can take us into lots of strange places. But I think you're right that there is a kind of analogy there. But I would agree with you that argument is just embarrassing, right? The homogeneity of causes argument. I really do think it begs the question in exactly the way you suggest that it does. But I want to come back just for a second to that aspirational argument.
Okay.
The one that, because this is the one that you could really imagine being put to a contemporary Western Buddhist who denies rebirth. And you say, are you a Mahayana practitioner? And she says, absolutely I am. Are you following the Bodhisattva path? Absolutely I am. Have you cultivated bodhicitta? Absolutely I have. So you aspire to awaken for the sake of all sentient beings? Yes. Do you think you're going to pull that off in the next 40 or 50 years? No way. So what kind of aspiration do you have? And I'm wondering whether you think that argument's got some bite.
I think it's the nub of the problem that I think a lot of people face. And it's interesting that Bachelor and Thurman, at the end of the Bachelor Thurman debate that the Tricycle put on that I mentioned, the farthest Bachelor is willing to go, because he's simply not going to accept that rebirth is likely or logical. He says he's agnostic on the question, and that he's of course famous for his Buddhist agnosticism. But he does say that he thinks that he could possibly act in such a way as to imagine that it might be the case, I'm paraphrasing here, but that it might be the case that there is rebirth, and to act along those lines.
Well, that's a wonderful idea, and I just want to push you on that too, because here's where there's a kind of affinity between you and Bachelor near the end of your essay, and I figure maybe after this, this question or some follow-up, we'll open this to discussion. But at the very close of your essay, you characterize your position as an as-if agnosticism, and there's a certain temptation to say, yeah, rebirth, you could be agnostic about that and think maybe there's rebirth and science hasn't found it. His Holiness the Dalai Lama likes to say that sometimes, right? He says, okay, look, if science contradicts Buddhism, you go with science. But science hasn't proved that there isn't rebirth, just hasn't shown that there is. But look, there's something a little funny. I mean, I remember when I first read the Tricycle debate, I just said, oh, come on, Stephen. What a wimp out. And, do you want to say I'm agnostic about whether Mount Meru is the center of the universe? No. I don't think you're agnostic about that. Though actually, should I tell you a parallel story about this? I was once in a conversation with another mutual friend of ours, Geshe Belden Drakpa, and was talking about the fact that His Holiness had just said at the Kalachakra initiation that, look, you just can't accept this stuff anymore. Buddhist cosmology with Mount Meru at the center has got to go. We want to stick with the stuff that's important. And I said, well, what do you think about that, Geshe-la? And he said, this is a sign of this degenerate age, that not even the Dalai Lama has the karma to see Mount Meru.
Wow.
So there are different positions one could take on Mount Meru, that it's there and we don't have the karma to see it, that it's not there, or you could be agnostic. And I'm wondering, are you an as-if agnostic about Mount Meru as the center of the universe?
No,
I hope not. Good.
But,
okay. So why is rebirth different?
Well, it's not actually. It's a little hard to explain this briefly, but it's part of. For me, the notion of an as-if, which is why I stole the term from Freud. He uses it in Picture of an Illusion to castigate a particular position that tries to defend religion on the basis of, well, let's sort of pretend that religion is true. But for me, it's a matter of working within what I would call a particular aesthetic, a Buddhist aesthetic, in which many of these, if you will, metaphysical or cosmological questions are either shunted aside or put in suspension, and you participate in the life of the tradition uncertain about certain aspects of it. I mean, it seems to me unlikely that there is a Mount Meru that's the center of the universe. No evidence to that effect has come to my attention recently. But on the other hand, if I do a mandala offering as a sort of Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, I'm imagining Mount Meru at the center of the universe with the 4 continents and the various subcontinents, and I enter into an imaginative procedure, which is what I do in many of the things that I do in my capacity as, quote, a Buddhist. So it's not necessarily, I don't know that it's even necessarily required to believe or not to believe. It's a question of finding, and everybody, as I say, has to find their own balance point, their own comfort level with this kind of thing. but I mean, I'll tell you, not exactly a story, but when I was reading Dharmakirti and, working on my dissertation on this very important chapter of this very important text, for me, initially, it was like everything about being a Buddhist hung in the balance. If Dharmakirti's argument worked, then I could be a Buddhist. If it didn't, forget about it. And the dissertation took a long time. And, when I came to the end of it, I more or less concluded, as has been suggested, that I didn't quite buy the argument, as appreciative as I was of the ingenuity involved. And then I sort of asked myself, well, does that mean I got to stop being a Buddhist? And the answer was no, because I had, in effect, become Buddhist in the sense of, a decade or more of participating in Buddhist life, Buddhist rituals, debating Buddhist philosophy. So, is being an X or a Y or a Z totally a matter of assent to propositions and doctrinal views of one sort, or is it a matter of sort of feeling your way into a way of life? And of course, I said at the outset that I was denying that Buddhism was a way of life, and that it, solely. But
yeah, I won't hold you to consistency, Roger.
Yes, no, I know you would.
but here's a really interesting question that arrives. I said I was going to turn it over to the audience, but I've got to ask you this question because you just forced me to. If there is any doctrine, well, no, I'm not started that way. There are several doctrines that you might say really are at the heart of Buddhism, and that you just really can't imagine Buddhism without them. And one is the doctrine of impermanence, the idea that all phenomena are impermanent. Of course, the Buddha says that the Buddha Dharma is impermanent too. Let's not go that big, but let's just ask about belief in rebirth. Maybe someone might say, the solution to your problem, your as-if problem, just as beliefs in Mount Meru as the center of the universe really were impermanent and it's time to let them go. Maybe belief in rebirth is impermanent and we just don't need that anymore. Why not go all the way? And then I'm going to shut up and let people from the audience ask questions.
Can I just say one thing, though?
Yeah.
I mean, I would agree with you that, I mean, again, in my own view, there's room for good and thoughtful disagreement on this. But for me, for a very long time, rebirth has not been essential, nor have all the details of karma and how it's supposed to work, say, although karma generally seems to me a fairly compelling psychological system. But for me, what has the kind of glue that's held me together as a Buddhist has been the doctrine of emptiness, but we could say that that's in some ways an extension of the doctrine of not self or of anatman. The willingness to explore the mind, and the importance of developing pro-social emotions like love and compassion, sympathetic joy, and so forth. Everything else, it seems to me, tends to pale beside those. And though, if for me anyway, if there's a core to Buddhism, it's found in those. And in that sense, maybe there's rebirth, maybe there isn't. But I keep trying to do what I keep trying to do, regardless of whether I'll go to Avicii for writing this essay.
Yeah, it's always a possibility, but I don't take that one too seriously either. I'm with you. I mean, for me, it's the Brahma Viharas and emptiness, and that's what I'm grateful for in Buddhism. But this has just been a fascinating conversation. As it's always fun talking with you, Roger. But I really should shut up now. There've been so many questions in the Q&A and in the chat, and I'm hoping that Carolyn has been keeping an eye on them and can tell us which are the most important ones to address.
I have.
Oh,
so
good.
We're going to start with a question from Sean about individual versus the collective in karma and rebirth. So he's asking, life continues, consciousness continues, but it's not your life or your consciousness. The karma of your actions continue to affect future lives and shape the consciousness of future generations. So he's asking if you can speak to the idea of rebirth as something collective, as the modernist Dr. B.R. Ambedkar.
Oh,
Bedkar.
yes,
Yeah,
Ambedkar.
yeah,
Yes.
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, go for it, Roger.
Oh, well, Ambedkar is a very, very interesting case because as many of you know, he was the great leader of the so-called untouchables or Dalits in India, an opponent of Gandhi, became a Buddhist very late in life, wrote this great book called The Buddha and His Dhamma, in which he basically refutes the idea of rebirth. And when he thinks about karma, does think of it in more collective terms. I mean, the question of collective karma is a tricky one, and I'm not sure I've puzzled it out entirely. They do talk about in some of the Abhidharma treatises, there is discussion of a kind of group karma that people will have. The Tibetans often say that you know the group karma they on the basis of which they had the Chinese invade and occupy their country in the 1950s was the fact that they, as Tibetans, they in quotes, had occupied the capital of China during the 8th century, that this was an instance of collective karma. But when you dig to me anyway, and Bhikkhu Bodhi could speak much more authoritatively on this, and Abhidharma experts could, but my sense is that collective karma is really just the sum of individual karmas that have been undergone by a variety of people in similar circumstances, such that the actions they perform lead to similar results, similar environments, and so forth. So whether there's a sort of a synergy of karma above and beyond a collection of individual karmas, I'm not so sure about that, but I don't know for sure.
Here's another way to think about that, though. And I'm not denying anything Roger said. I think it's a lovely, lovely answer. But just as we can think about collectives as supervening on their parts, but not identical to them. So when we think about the United States, for instance, it's not identical to the Americans there are now. New ones are being born and dying and immigrating and emigrating all the time. But we can still talk about the history of the United States. And we can still talk about where the United States is now, given what it did in the past, without identifying individuals. So, I mean, there's something to be said that right now, we are reckoning with the collective karma that originated in the institution of chattel slavery. And that's true regardless of whether that's my karma or Roger's karma or anybody else's karma. As part of this collective, we participate in the karmic consequences of what this collective did a few hundred years ago. And I just don't think you can escape that. So when I think about karma, which I think is much easier to naturalize than rebirth, I think of it as just the consequences of actions. And there are consequences for actions, both individual and collective. And I don't think they need to be reducible to one another.
Yeah. One other, I wasn't quite sure I got everything in the question, but I do want to at least emphasize the point that, and this is, you know, Jay presented a very interesting notion about building the cathedral, and you're not going to live to see it, but your descendants might. I do think that the traditional Buddhist view is that fundamentally karma is individual. And so whatever I do in this life, there will be some kind of, quote, continuation in a future life. And of course, for Buddhists, putting together the notion of rebirth with the notions of impermanence, especially radical impermanence, and no self has always been a struggle. It was the point on which non-Buddhist traditions criticized them most roundly in India. And of course, there have been many ingenious attempts by Buddhists to explain how the world can work without a substantial permanent self. I think the Abhidharma literature, which is sometimes not given very good press, actually is an ingenious attempt to describe the world in terms of impermanent events that don't require some kind of substantial self. All that notwithstanding, you know, I do something bad in this life. The fundamental Buddhist view is I'm going to get my just deserts in either this life later or some future life. So in that sense, karma is not I agree that the notion of collective karma is a very interesting one, and I think of it as a construction, though, in ways that the notion of individual karma and rebirth is somewhat less of a construction. It's all construction all the way down, as we know, but that's a discussion for another day.
Well, and I'm wondering, we also have some questions. Several people are grappling with the doctrine of no self, as you've spoken to briefly, and emptiness, and reconciling that with the idea of reincarnation and rebirth. And I'm sure this is something that we could speak to for a long time, and you have started to touch on it. But I'm wondering if you have more to say about that for those of us who are still trying to wrap our heads around, bringing the two together.
Right. Well, I would say that in fact, the classic, I mean, there were many presentations of this in early Buddhist tradition, but in some ways, to me, the classic presentation of it is by Nagarjuna, the great philosopher of the Madhyamaka school, the great philosopher of emptiness, who in the 18th verse of the 24th chapter of his fundamental stanzas on the middle way, which I've heard His Holiness the Dalai Lama discourse on just that verse for like 2 hours at a time. He makes an equation between emptiness and dependent origination. Dependent origination is another way of talking about how causes and conditions bring about events in the world, and it's all impermanent, all of that. And for Nagarjuna, in the context of that chapter, Nagarjuna's opponent is saying, well, look, if everything is empty, and Nagarjuna has spent 23 chapters showing this is empty, that is empty, time is empty, motion is empty, causation is empty. It seems to be utterly nihilistic. And the opponent says, well, if that's the case, then, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but then, basic items of the Buddhist path and cosmology are empty too, and they're annihilated. And Nagarjuna says, you've totally misunderstood what I'm doing. I'm talking from the ultimate standpoint. From the ultimate standpoint, there is no substantially existent causation or time or motion or Buddha for that matter. But in fact, conventionally, all these things are reasonable and exist. And in fact, and here's one of the great sort of jujitsu moves in Indian philosophical history. He said, it's not only that emptiness does not annihilate rebirth and the path and Buddhahood and arhatship, it's that if things were not empty, none of this could actually be the case, because the world is, if you will, commonsensically a changing, shifting, impermanent world. And dependent arising is simply the term that describes that. And things cannot dependently arise if they are empty, if they are not empty, because the opposite of being empty is being permanent, independent, partless, and so forth. So it's a brilliant move. Now, for some, Nagarjuna himself, at the end of another text of his, Averting the Arguments, in his commentary to the very last verse, basically says, emptiness is dependent arising, and because of emptiness, all dependent arisings are valid and true, i.e. the conventional world is true, and this includes arhatship, rebirth, and so forth and so on. Now, I would not make that jump. I would say that emptiness does, as Nagarjuna brilliantly argues, establish the validity of the conventional world, but what the conventional world actually consists of, whether there's rebirth or not, whether the sky is blue, whether there's Mount Meru, all these are matters for, if you will, conventional philosophical debate. But the key thing here is the harmony between dependent arising and emptiness, such that to say things are empty is to say that they arise dependently. To say that they arise dependently is to say that they are empty. This is a point that Nagarjuna makes. Tsongkhapa in the Tibetan tradition had made very, very powerfully, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama makes repeatedly. So it's a key to showing that the doctrines of emptiness or no self are not nihilistic.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Another question, are there descriptions of bodhicitta you've come across that don't require rebirth and a belief in karma?
I mean, literature on bodhicitta itself tends, because traditional literature tends to be framed within the assumption of multiple lives and of the reality of karma. I mean, I think that modern, just as I suggested, that there are certain Buddhist doctrines and practices that you could probably follow or accept without necessarily committing absolutely to rebirth. It seems to me that the vow to try to be of benefit to as many beings as possible, I mean, that's not even necessarily an exclusively Buddhist standpoint. So it doesn't necessarily, I think Christians who attempt to practice charity and love, they operate within a very different cosmology than the Buddhist, and theirs is not a rebirth-oriented cosmology. And for that matter, secular humanists who strive to be of benefit to humanity, and they don't accept any particular religious cosmology, and yet it seems to me that we could count them among, if you will, the bodhisattvas. So I'm willing to grant a lot of leeway on this, and I guess my answer would be no. I don't think that developing something like bodhicitta requires an acceptance of rebirth. Though again, traditional Buddhists giving traditional explanations of what bodhicitta really means will say, as I think Bob Thurman said all those years ago, it tends to weaken it, and maybe weaken the resolve too, if you don't have this notion of a kind of heroic march through life after life towards some grand and glorious Buddhahood.
On the other hand, the great vow in Zen is an expression of the Bodhisattva vow.
Mm-hmm.
Does not mention or rely on rebirth at all, and in fact acknowledges its own paradoxical nature. Right?
Yes,
Sentient beings are countless. I vow to save them all. Right.
Right.
Buddha Dharma is inaccessible. I vow to access it.
Right.
So when we're talking about traditional Buddhists, we've got to decide which traditions we mean.
No, absolutely.
And again, you go to East Asia, bodhicitta is there, and rebirth is not quite as there.
Okay.
So,
yeah, and I would agree. I mean, I do a lot of work on the Mahasiddhas and folks like Saraha and Talopa and Naropa, and their rhetoric is a bit like that of Zen. Maybe not quite as fully paradoxical, but yes, there's absolutely, when we talk about tradition, we have to remember that Buddhist tradition has been contested all the way along, and that for that matter, the so-called tradition modernity divide is quite arbitrary. So everything is, things have been up for grabs for a long time, not just since 1800 or something.
Well, I think we have to end it there. It's just after 4, but thank you so much, both of you, for this wonderful conversation. And thank you for everyone who joined us on the call and asked their questions. This talk will be recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel. So we'll give you the link in the chat. This is the final conversation in this series. So thank you again to everyone who joined us throughout the week. And again, we're providing these sessions for free. So if you feel moved to donate, please do so at the link in the chat box. And don't forget that you can receive 30% off your copy of Secularizing Buddhism, also by clicking on the link and the coupon code in the chat box. So thanks again, Roger. Thank you, Jay. And
thanks,
to
Jay.
everyone.
Thanks for bringing us together.
Yeah, it's great fun. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.